On a gray December morning in Stockholm, a young mother drops her child at a state-run daycare center. She doesn't pray for her daughter's safety. She doesn't thank God for the subsidized childcare that allows her to work. In fact, she hasn't been to church since her grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. Yet tonight, she'll volunteer at a homeless shelter. Tomorrow, she'll donate to a climate change charity. Next week, she'll organize a fundraiser for refugees. She has never read the Bible cover to cover, never memorized the Ten Commandments, and couldn't tell you the difference between Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But by nearly every measurable standard, she lives what many would call a deeply moral life. This isn't an isolated case. It's the norm across much of Northern Europe, where the pews sit empty but the societies flourish in ways that would astound the philosophers and theologians who once insisted that morality was impossible without divine commandments. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic. These nations rank among the least religious on earth, with atheism and agnosticism reaching levels that would have been unthinkable just a century ago. Between 60 and 80% of citizens in these countries say religion plays little to no role in their daily lives. In the Czech Republic, over 70% identify as non-religious. In Sweden, church attendance hovers around 5%. And yet, here's what should shake our assumptions to their core. These same societies consistently rank at the very top of global indexes for happiness, life satisfaction, social cohesion, trust, charitable giving, volunteerism, environmental protection, gender equality, and low levels of corruption and violent crime. The homicide rate in Denmark is 1.0 per 100,000 people. In the deeply religious United States, it's 6.3, more than 6 times higher. Sweden's Corruption Perception Index score places it among the cleanest governments in the world, while highly religious nations like the Philippines struggle with endemic corruption. Norwegian prisons, run on principles of rehabilitation rather than punishment, have recidivism rates of just 20%, compared to 76% in the United States. These aren't cherry-picked statistics. They represent a pattern that demands explanation. For thousands of years, the dominant narrative has been clear. Religion is the foundation of morality. Without God, without sacred texts, without the promise of heaven or the threat of hell, humanity would descend into chaos. Dostoevsky captured this sentiment perfectly when he wrote, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." This wasn't just Russian literature, it was the conventional wisdom of millennia. So, what happened in Europe? How did these societies seemingly defy gravity, building some of the most ethical, compassionate, and functional communities in human history, while simultaneously abandoning the religious frameworks that were supposed to make such communities possible? The answer takes us on a journey through philosophy, history, neuroscience, and social psychology. It reveals uncomfortable truths about the relationship between belief and behavior, challenges assumptions held by both the religious and secular, and ultimately forces us to reconsider what morality actually is and where it comes from. But before we dive deeper, this is Professor Archive, and we're embarking on one of the most controversial questions in human thought. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely fascinated to see our global community. Let's start with what seems like a paradox. When Americans are surveyed about atheists, consistent patterns emerge. A 2020 Pew Research study found that 43% of Americans believe it's necessary to believe in God to be moral. In more religious regions of the United States, this number climbs above 60%. Yet these same Americans, when asked if they personally know any moral atheists, overwhelmingly say yes. The atheist neighbor who shovels snow from elderly residents' driveways. The non-believing colleague who organizes the office charity drive. The agnostic family member who volunteers at the soup kitchen. At an individual level, people recognize morality in the godless. But abstractly, theoretically, they maintain that it shouldn't be possible. This cognitive dissonance isn't new. In fact, it's been the elephant in the room of moral philosophy for centuries. Even Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, who argued that all morality flows from divine law, had to acknowledge that pagans and non-believers often demonstrated virtue. His solution was to claim that God had written his law in every human heart through natural law, so even those who rejected God were still, unknowingly, following his commands. It was an elegant theological workaround, but it raised an obvious question. If people can follow moral law without knowing it comes from God, without believing in God, without worshiping God, then what's doing the actual moral work? The divine commandment or something else entirely? The European experiment in secular morality didn't happen overnight. It was born from centuries of bloodshed that made people deeply suspicious of mixing religious conviction with public life. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 killed roughly 8 million people, about 20% of the population in some German states. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other with righteous fury, each side absolutely certain that God was on their side, that they were defending ultimate truth, that the stakes were eternal souls. When the Peace of Westphalia finally ended the carnage, European intellectuals began asking dangerous questions. If religious certainty could produce such horror, perhaps certainty itself was the problem. Perhaps tolerance, doubt, and secular governance were safer foundations for society. The Enlightenment grew from this blood-soaked soil. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant began constructing moral systems that didn't require divine revelation. Spinoza, excommunicated from his Jewish community for heresy, argued that ethics could be derived from reason and understanding nature. Hume famously demonstrated that you cannot logically derive an ought from an is, that no amount of factual observation could tell you what's morally right. But he also showed that human nature itself, our capacity for sympathy, and our desire for social approval, provided sufficient grounding for morality. Kant went further, proposing his categorical imperative. Act only according to rules you could will to be universal laws. No God needed, just rational consistency. But these were just ideas, philosophical thought experiments. The real test came when societies actually tried to build moral communities without religious foundations. And against all predictions from religious authorities, it worked. In fact, it worked remarkably well. Modern secular Europe emerged gradually through the 20th century, accelerating after World War II. Sweden's transformation is particularly striking. In 1900, Sweden was deeply Lutheran, with church attendance rates above 70%. The state church held enormous power over social life, controlling education, marriage, and moral instruction. But through the 20th century, the Social Democrats systematically built a welfare state that essentially took over the church's traditional role of caring for the vulnerable. Need help with childcare? The state provides it. Unemployed? There's robust support. Sick? Healthcare is guaranteed. Elderly? Pensions are generous. The church had historically been the primary provider of social services, education, and community support. As the state assumed these functions and did them well, religion's practical importance declined. By 2000, only 5% of Swedes attended church regularly, one of the lowest rates in the world. The Church of Sweden continued to exist, but it had become largely ceremonial, a provider of traditional rituals for weddings and funerals rather than a source of daily moral guidance. Yet Sweden didn't collapse into moral chaos. Quite the opposite. Crime decreased, trust increased, social cohesion strengthened. The question that haunted philosophers became empirically answerable. Yes, you can build a highly moral society without religion. But here's where it gets really interesting. The collapse of religious belief in Europe wasn't accompanied by a collapse in moral behavior, but it was accompanied by a transformation in how people thought about morality. Swedish sociologist Phil Zuckerman spent 14 months studying secular life in Scandinavia. What he found was that Scandinavians hadn't abandoned moral frameworks, they'd simply shifted the foundation. Instead of divine commandment, they emphasized empathy and consequence. Instead of sin and salvation, they focused on harm and well-being. The question changed from, what does God command, to, how does this affect others? This shift reveals something profound about human moral psychology. Modern neuroscience and evolutionary biology have given us remarkable insights into where moral intuitions actually come from. And the answer isn't scripture, it's evolution. We are social primates who evolved in small groups where cooperation was essential for survival. The humans who flourished were those who could cooperate, who felt empathy, who experienced guilt when they harmed group members, who felt gratitude when helped and anger when cheated. These emotional responses, what psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls moral foundations, are hardwired into our brains long before we learn any religious doctrine. Brain imaging studies reveal that when people make moral judgments, the active regions aren't the ones associated with religious belief or theological reasoning. They're the regions associated with emotion, empathy, and social cognition. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, crucial for processing emotions and making decisions, lights up during moral judgments. The temporoparietal junction, involved in theory of mind and understanding others' perspectives, activates when we consider harm to others. These neural structures evolved millions of years before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam existed. They're the biological foundation of morality, present in religious and non-religious people alike. In fact, studies comparing moral reasoning between religious and non-religious individuals find few significant differences in actual moral judgments. Both groups agree that murder is wrong, that helping others is good, that fairness matters. Where they differ is in the justification. The religious person says, because God commands it. The secular person says, because it causes harm or because I wouldn't want it done to me. But the underlying moral intuition, the gut feeling that certain actions are right or wrong, operates identically. This is powerfully illustrated by what philosophers call the Euthyphro dilemma, named after a Platonic dialogue. Socrates asks, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If morality is simply whatever God commands, then God could command murder, and it would become moral, a troubling implication most believers reject. But if God commands things because they're already good, then goodness exists independent of God, and God is simply recognizing moral truths that exist on their own. Either way, you end up with morality that doesn't ultimately depend on divine authority. Now, I know some of you watching this have found real value in this channel, and if that's you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd consider leaving a super thanks. It directly supports the deep research that goes into these documentaries and allows us to keep creating content that challenges assumptions and explores complex ideas. But whether you do or not, I'm just glad you're here for the journey. Let's address the obvious counter-argument. Critics of secular morality often point to the 20th century's atheist totalitarian regimes. Stalin's Soviet Union killed millions. Mao's China engineered famines and purges. Pol Pot's Cambodia perpetrated genocide. These were explicitly atheist regimes, and they committed monstrous evils. Doesn't this prove that removing God removes moral constraints? It's a serious argument, but it misunderstands what happened in these societies. These regimes didn't simply abandon religion, they replaced it with pseudo-religious ideologies. Stalinism and Maoism functioned as secular religions, complete with sacred texts, infallible prophets, heresy trials, and absolute moral certainty. The problem wasn't the absence of God, it was the presence of dogmatic certainty and authoritarian control. In fact, the very things that made these ideologies dangerous, absolute truth claims, punishment of dissent, division of the world into pure believers and evil heretics. These are features they shared with religious extremism, not with secular humanism. The key difference with modern secular Europe is pluralism and doubt. Scandinavian societies don't claim to have absolute truth. They don't demand ideological conformity. They build systems that acknowledge human fallibility and create checks and balances against the abuse of power. This intellectual humility, this comfort with uncertainty, may actually be secular morality's greatest strength. But here's something that should make secular people uncomfortable. While you don't need religion for morality, there's compelling evidence that religious communities have historically been very effective at promoting certain pro-social behaviors. Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam's research on social capital reveals that religious communities create dense networks of trust and reciprocity. Church members volunteer more, donate more to charity, both religious and secular, and participate more in civic organizations. Even after controlling for other factors, religious attendance correlates with higher levels of community engagement. The mechanism seems to be community itself, not belief. What churches provide is regular gathering, shared purpose, social accountability, and institutional structure for collective action. It's harder to ignore your neighbor's suffering when you see them every Sunday. It's easier to volunteer when your church organizes the volunteer effort. The beliefs matter less than the social infrastructure. Secular Europe has had to rebuild this infrastructure without churches. They've done it through robust civil society organizations, strong labor unions, high levels of civic participation, and perhaps most importantly, a strong sense of collective identity and mutual obligation enforced through social norms rather than religious doctrine. In Denmark, there's a concept called janteloven, or the law of Jante, a set of informal social rules that discourage individual boasting and reinforce collective equality. You're not better than others. You don't imagine yourself superior. We're all in this together. It's not from the Bible, it's from a novel, but it functions as powerful moral instruction nonetheless. The Nordic model also invests heavily in early childhood education that explicitly teaches empathy, cooperation, and democratic values. Danish kindergartens have empathy lessons, where children learn to recognize emotions in themselves and others. Norwegian schools emphasize Bildung, a concept of education that focuses on developing the whole person, including moral and emotional development, not just academic knowledge. These societies have essentially created secular moral education systems that fulfill the function churches once served. There's also the crucial role of trust. High-trust societies can maintain cooperation without heavy religious enforcement because people generally expect others to behave well. Denmark consistently ranks as one of the world's highest trust societies. In surveys, over 70% of Danes say most people can be trusted, compared to about 30% of Americans. This trust creates a virtuous cycle. When you trust others, you cooperate more. When cooperation works, trust increases. Religion isn't necessary to bootstrap this cycle, though historically it often played that role. But let's be honest about the challenges. Secular Europe faces moral questions it struggles to answer without religious frameworks. End-of-life issues are particularly fraught. The Netherlands and Belgium have legalized euthanasia, but the debates reveal deep uncertainty about the value of life without religious absolutes. If there's no soul, no divine spark, is human life merely a calculation of quality versus suffering? Most secular Europeans would reject this cold calculus, but articulating why in purely secular terms proves difficult. They fall back on concepts like dignity and autonomy, but these are themselves moral values that require justification. Immigration has revealed another tension. As Europe becomes more diverse with significant Muslim populations, secular societies grapple with accommodating religious values they've moved beyond. France's ban on religious symbols in schools, intended to preserve secular public space, strikes many as intolerant. But allowing religious law to govern family matters, as some advocate, seems to abandon hard-won principles of equality. These aren't easy questions, and secular philosophy doesn't provide clear answers the way religious law claims to. There's also what we might call the meaning problem. Religion doesn't just provide moral rules, it provides cosmic significance. Your actions matter not just for this life, but for eternity. You're part of a grand narrative that transcends your individual existence. Secular morality can tell you to be good, but it struggles to explain why the universe should care. For many people, this matters deeply. The existential emptiness that Nietzsche warned about when he declared God dead isn't just philosophical, it's deeply felt. Suicide rates in highly secular societies are complex. influenced by many factors, but Scandinavia has historically had higher rates than more religious societies, though this has shifted in recent decades. Yet here's a fascinating development. Many secular Europeans report deep meaning and purpose in their lives, despite or perhaps because of the absence of cosmic significance. The philosopher Julian Baggini, who studied secular communities extensively, found that people derive profound meaning from relationships, from contributing to their communities, from aesthetic experiences, from understanding the natural world. Meaning doesn't require the supernatural, it requires connection to something beyond yourself. A cause, a community, the continuation of humanity, the wonder of existence itself. In fact, there's an argument that secular morality is more genuinely moral precisely because it lacks cosmic enforcement. If you help someone only because God will reward you, or you avoid murder only because you fear hell, are you really moral? Or are you just calculating self-interest with an eternal time horizon? The secular person who helps others without expectation of divine reward, who acts morally because they've reflected on what kind of person they want to be and what kind of world they want to live in, might be exhibiting a purer form of morality. Immanuel Kant made this argument explicitly. He believed that moral actions had worth only when done from duty, from recognition of moral law, not from inclination or fear of punishment. By this standard, the atheist who acts morally despite knowing there's no cosmic reward demonstrates moral character more clearly than the believer whose goodness is motivated by salvation. Of course, most believers would reject this characterization. They'd argue they don't follow God's commands merely for reward, but out of love, gratitude, and recognition of objective goodness. Fair enough. But this returns us to the fundamental question. If the motivation is love and recognition of goodness, then those are the real moral foundations, not the belief in God per se. A secular person can experience love and recognize goodness just as fully. The data from Europe suggests that the key factors in creating moral societies are not religious belief, but social structure, education, equality, and trust. The Nordic countries combine strong welfare states that reduce desperation and competition with excellent education systems that teach critical thinking and empathy. They have low inequality, which reduces social friction and resentment. They have transparent institutions that maintain trust. And they have strong civil societies where people participate in collective action. Interestingly, the United States and Europe have essentially run a centuries-long experiment with different approaches. America maintained high religiosity while building capitalism with limited welfare. Europe reduced religiosity while building robust social democracies. The results are clear in the data. Europe has less crime, less violence, greater happiness, longer life expectancy, and higher social mobility. This doesn't prove religion is bad. Many European societies were highly functional when they were religious. But it clearly disproves the claim that religion is necessary for moral societies. There's a crucial historical point that often gets overlooked. The moral progress of the past few centuries, the abolition of slavery, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, the end of torture and cruel punishment, these didn't come from more religion but from less, or at least from more liberal, flexible religion. The Bible explicitly condones slavery, subordinates women, and mandates death for homosexuality. It was Enlightenment secularism, not fundamentalist Christianity, that drove moral progress. Religious institutions eventually came along, reinterpreting their texts, but they were following, not leading, the moral evolution. This suggests that human moral intuitions, shaped by reason, empathy, and changing social circumstances, are the real drivers of moral progress. Religious texts and institutions then adapt to these evolved intuitions, usually after significant resistance. The Catholic Church now opposes slavery and supports democracy, positions that would have shocked medieval popes. This evolution is admirable, but it reveals that the source of moral truth isn't static divine revelation, but dynamic human moral reasoning. So where does this leave us? Can you be moral without religion? The evidence from secular Europe provides a resounding yes. Not just that individuals can be moral, we've always known that, but that entire societies can be highly moral, arguably more successfully moral by many measures, without religious foundations. The morality of these societies isn't perfect, no societies is, but it demonstrates that human beings possess innate capacities for empathy, fairness, and cooperation that don't depend on belief in the supernatural. But here's the nuance that both ardent atheists and defensive believers often miss. While you don't need religion for morality, religion has historically been one very effective way of organizing and promoting moral behavior. Religious communities create accountability, provide meaning, organize charity, and transmit moral wisdom across generations. The question isn't whether religion can produce morality, it obviously can. The question is whether it's the only way, and the answer is clearly no. The deeper truth might be this: morality comes from our nature as social beings who need to cooperate to survive and flourish. Evolution gave us the emotional and cognitive tools for morality, empathy, reciprocity, sense of fairness, ability to imagine consequences. Culture, whether religious or secular, then shapes how we apply these tools. Religion traditionally provided the primary cultural framework, but it's not the only possible framework. Secular philosophy, humanist values, democratic principles, and social solidarity can do the same work. Perhaps the real lesson from secular Europe is that the content of morality, don't murder, help others, be fair, act with compassion, these principles emerge from human nature and social life itself. They predate any particular religion and persist when religion fades. What changes is the justification, the story we tell ourselves about why we should be good. For religious people, it's divine command and cosmic significance. For secular people, it's human flourishing and social consequences. Both can work. Neither has a monopoly on truth. The Swedish mother we met at the beginning volunteers at the homeless shelter, not because she fears hell or hopes for heaven. She does it because she feels empathy for suffering, because she was educated in a system that taught her to care about others, because she lives in a society where such caring is expected and valued, and because it gives her life meaning and connects her to her community. Her morality is no less real, no less powerful, and arguably no less admirable than if it were religiously motivated. In the end, the question, can you be moral without religion, might be the wrong question. The better question is, what produces human flourishing? What creates societies where people treat each other with dignity, where suffering is minimized, where justice prevails, and where individuals find meaning and connection? The evidence suggests many paths lead there. Religion is one, but the secular humanism of Northern Europe is demonstrably another. And that's perhaps the most important lesson. In questions of morality, as in so much of life, there may be no single answer, no exclusive path, but rather multiple ways for human beings to become, and help each other become, the best versions of themselves. The experiment continues. Secular Europe is still evolving, facing new challenges, refining its moral frameworks. Future generations will judge its success not by abstract philosophical standards, but by the simple measure of human well-being. By that standard, at this moment in history, the verdict is remarkably positive. Societies can indeed be deeply moral without divine commandments, not because they've found some replacement for God, but because they've discovered what was there all along: the moral capacities that evolution built into us and the social structures that allow those capacities to flourish.